Thank you for joining us this afternoon. My name is Dick Stolley, an alumnus of Medill, a Board of Advisors member, and one of the 3 judges for the Medill Medal for Courage in Journalism. We are here today to honor 2 brave journalists. But before I begin, I'd like to recognize 2 special guests. Gary Marks and David Jackson, who were the Medill Medal recipients last year for the Chicago Tribune series tracking murder, rape, and other felony suspects who had fled the U.S. to avoid trial. Gary, David, are you here?
I think they must be stuck in traffic. I don't see them. They will be here, we know. Yeah.
I was deceived. Never lie to a reporter. All right, the Medill Medal was established 10 years ago, 2003, to celebrate journalists who display great courage in reporting. The award goes beyond physical bravery and distinguishes those who display moral, ethical, and economic courage as well. Past winners include journalists who were imprisoned in the Middle East, survived natural disasters, and experienced personal trauma. This year, the medal goes to C.J. Chivers, Chris, and Ben Hubbard, both of whom are now at the New York Times. However, in 2012, Ben was working for the Associated Press, and it is for their respective stories last year that they are receiving this joint award. It calls attention to both reporters' work in Syria, where Hubbard and Chivers put their lives on the line to report on the civil war there, placing the need for accurate, in-depth reporting above their own safety. Both men went in and out of Syria multiple times in 2012, often traveling by foot and at night to avoid detection. They managed to gain the trust of rebel groups and report amidst violence, treachery, and the constant threat of capture. Their stories offer a glimpse into the country most readers are very unfamiliar with, covered with the utmost accuracy possible in a war. Any reporter who has been shot at, as I have been, read their stories in awe. I know you want to hear from our honorees, so we'll make this ceremony short. First, I'd like our other judges to join me on the stage to present the medals. Professor Donna Leff is here. Ellen Soderberg may be en route, we're told. Will you please come up? And that, Ben and CJ, would you join us up here also, please? Ben? There's a box. Congratulations to both of you, and now it's your turn to tell us firsthand about your work in Syria. We've asked Tim McNulty, Medill faculty member and co-director of Medill's National Security Journalism Initiative, to moderate today. Tim itself is no stranger to international reporting. He is a veteran journalist whose career in national and foreign news includes roles as both war correspondent and White House correspondent. I'm not sure of the difference between the two. As the national and later foreign editor of the Chicago Tribune, he helped direct the newspaper's coverage of the September 11 tragedy, the American strike into Afghanistan, and the invasion of Iraq. Tim, the floor is yours. Gentlemen, have a seat.
War correspondent is much better than White House correspondent. Before we start, Chris, you wanted to say something about medals, and I thought this might be a good time.
Sure, I think we should say it, I'll say it for both of us. As part of receiving the medal, the first sort of responsibility is to deflect it. Not the idea of courage, but the idea that Ben and I are any different than any other number of people who've worked in Syria. We are two members of a class of journalists that is dozens and dozens deep and wide who went into Syria in 2012 in largely the same way, doing largely the same thing, in pretty much entirely the same circumstances. And we are not any different and certainly no better than this pack. And the second thing to say is this pack unto itself could not work, did not work, and would have accomplished nothing without the help of all the Syrians who made it possible. Syrians brought us in, took us out, and hosted us. They guided our trips. They made the work possible. Every word, every photograph, every bit of video is because of them. And their circumstances are different than ours. We get to come and go. You know, we return to our families and our friends who are outside of Syria and outside the reach of serious troubles. The people who helped us don't have that luxury. They live in the danger. Their social circle, their friends and their families are in many cases at risk or threatened by the work they do to help us. So as part of these medals that are on the table here, I'd like you to think of them not as ours, but we're sort of here to speak about a job that involves a lot more other people who are much more brave and a lot more at stake than we do.
Thank you. Before the question, and I'm going to ask a few questions, but I really want to spend a lot of time listening to your questions. Before my question, I wanted to just point out that there's a difference in age of these two men. They have something in common. Both are graduates of journalism grad schools. They both worked for the New York Times, but they were both in great danger at times in 2012. Ben is more of a kind of traditional foreign correspondent. He speaks French and Arabic. Chris speaks a little Russian, or used to speak more Russian, but Ben's an Arabist. He was a Peace Corps volunteer in Togo, West Africa. Chris was a captain in the Marine Corps and in the first Gulf War, which, of course, most students weren't born in the first Gulf War, but it existed. And so they bring very different skills. Ben is an Arabist, but can talk to the people in the region in their own tongue. Chris, with his military background, he knows armaments, he knows ordnance, he understands tactics. He can look at something, as he did a few weeks ago with the UN report on chemical weapons in Syria, and buried in the report was where these shells landed, and he was able to, I don't know how you call it, triangulate or do somehow figure out the trajectory of these shells, and seeing that they came from government positions, which the UN did not point out. They just laid out where they landed. So I think that the notion of journalism is more than just reporting. It's what a journalist, besides courage, what other things a journalist brings to the story. And these two obviously have brought a great deal. So I wanted to start off with kind of laying a little groundwork of 2012, going in and out of Syria, but I don't know exactly what that means and how you did it. I believe both of you maybe have gone through Turkey, but I wondered if you could tell us in a little bit of detail how you went in, what you carried, how long you spent, what you did, and how you got out. And then how that evolved from then to the way it is reporting now.
It changed over the course of the year. My first trip was in June of last year, which was fairly early. There were a number of people who had gone in before I did, but that was still, people were still kind of warming up and figuring out how to get in and things like that. But it was kind of quite early, I guess, in when people were going in. And I mean, like Chris said, it was very much dependent on sort of local Syrian context that we had. I mean, at that point, we had information coming out of northern Syria that was basically provided by activists who were on the ground, and when things would happen, they would shoot videos of what was happening, and they would put it on YouTube. So we'd get these videos that were shot with somebody's camera phone, and they're sort of blurry and jumping all over the place, and you don't really know what's going on. So then when it came time to actually go there, we had to figure out, you know, where, you know, how are we actually going to get in? How are we going to get across the border? And then where is kind of our first place where we can go and stop, basically? And then from there, we sort of come up with the rest of our plan. And so it was all done through, you know, just through working with Syrians who were there, activists and people who were connected to some of the, at that point, quite new rebel groups that were starting up there. And so we would just, you know, meet with people we were, at that point, we were working out of Turkey. And so we'd meet in Turkey with these people and talk to them about where we can go in and how we can cross and whatever. And so the first trip was very, very basic in that we, the border crossings were still not run by the rebels and stuff. So we basically, you know, kind of made a plan of how we were going to go in, and then we loaded all of our stuff into backpacks. I mean, I think I was with the AP, and so we had kind of a full format team where we're three of us. We had a TV person, a photographer, and myself, a print person. And then we had a Syrian guy that was with us that was kind of our guide to get in. And we each carried a backpack with, you know, a few changes of clothes, and then we had satellite phones and satellite internet, just like little internet setups and computers, and we went, and we just basically went out and, you know, waited until a certain time of night when sort of everybody knew when the Turkish border patrols would be, when there would be a hole in the border patrols, and then we just walked across the olive groves, and, you know, our guy sort of took us across, and then next thing you know, we were in Syria. And then from there, we kind of went to where ended up being our first sort of safe house where we stayed, and then we would kind of move around from there. And that was kind of the MO for that trip. At that point, the rebels were still quite disorganized, and they were very, very interested in having us. At that point, I think that the general mood inside of the opposition was that the outside world only needs to understand what's happening, and then they're going to come help us. They're going to come save us. If Obama really knew, I think I'm saying what they thought is, you know, if Obama or if the Americans really knew how much we were suffering and how much the government was, what the government was doing to us, they would immediately come and save us. And so then they would say, oh, well, these journalists, you know, this is perfect. You know, we bring them in and they take photos and they see some of the destruction or whatever, and the next thing you know, we're gonna get saved. So it was very easy to work in. But what we were scared of then was the government, because the government still had a number of checkpoints in various areas. There were still airstrikes going on, and so at that point we knew that we could sort of count on them to get us around, but we always had to be aware of what the government was up to if we were going to run into a checkpoint, and then we would get captured by the government. And so then I sort of speed things up a little bit. I went back a few months later, and the rebels had taken the border crossings. And so at that point, we would drive up to the border crossing. The Turks would look at our passports, stamp them, and we'd go across. And then there would be a bunch of rebel guys there with their Kalashnikovs and their, you know, army uniforms. And they would say, hey, we're glad to have you here. Where are you headed? And they would sort of register us, you know, in some little, who knows, just to sort of act like it was official. And then they would let us go. And so we would, you know, come in and out quite freely. And since then, it's very, very much changed. And I think that original faith in what they thought they were going to get out of the media is gone. I mean, I think that belief in we just need to show the rest of the world what we're going through, and then they're going to come help us. I think they eventually gave up on that. So now the reason we don't go in anymore is because we can't trust everybody in the opposition. I think that there's enough people there. I think there's still plenty of people that would love to have us come in and that would love to help us out to see what the situation is. But there are so many other elements there right now that we're just a business opportunity, or we're, you know, potential spies, or we're, so that's, at some point probably early this year, the whole equation flipped, where it was just really, there was no way that you could safely go in as an outsider, because you couldn't sort of count on local support for what you were trying to do.
So Chris, was your experience somewhat the same?
It's similar. We had the ambition of doing trips for about 5 days at a time. And our planning would probably take about 5 days before we went in. So we'd go to Turkey. We had some Syrians we were working with and some commanders who were willing to host us. And so we'd hold these meetings. You'd end up drinking gallons of tea over several days, and you figure out in your mind, and eventually we got into the habit of putting it on paper, exactly what you were doing logistically, where you were going, where you were staying. And you had to kind of build your own safety net in Syria, or deceive yourself into the thought that you were building one, because there was very little medical care inside. It's very little fuel inside, very little transportation inside. So if you got hurt or someone you were with became hurt, if someone was wounded, the really only hope you had was what you could do yourself in terms of stabilizing injury and getting out. And so we would work extensively on kind of building the safety net, training staff in battlefield trauma, getting the right equipment. And then it was, like you said, backpacks, water. We brought in our own water and food. We tried to develop a very rigid sort of set of ethical guidelines for what we were doing. We didn't want to take any food from the people we were staying with because there wasn't much. We didn't want to take any water. We felt the responsibility not to get hurt and not to burden them. And the trips were only 5 days long for a few reasons. One was certainly safety, that you were watched everywhere you went, and the longer you spend, the higher the risks go up. But we also decided in practical terms not to write while we were inside. 5 days is a very finite time. And we didn't want to waste the time writing or looking at our laptops when we thought we should be talking to Syria and sort of looking at the story. So we would go in for about 5 days, sleep very little, work extensively, inhale everything we could. And we also thought it was important not to be using our electronics. We didn't feel we needed to file right away. The stories could keep a few days, so we didn't think that we should incur the risks on the people who are hosting us. By using your satellite phone, by using your computer, even by using your mobile phone, you're leaving a signature behind that could come back and haunt someone. So we would go in and stay basically, what the military would call calm dark, and not try to turn anything on except the cameras, and then come back out and file. And in practical terms, 5 days of immersion reporting gives you more than you can process quickly. So the 5th day, we were already kind of feeling a little bit overloaded in what we had to say, and we'd come back out. And then this ethics that we tried to follow has informed our decision to stop doing entirely what we were doing. I mean, I can hold up my hand and say, I'm not going into Syria anymore. And I recommend against most journalists, and certainly any journalist who looks like us and cannot pass, I would ask them not to go into Syria at the moment, because the people who host you are in grave danger. You're in danger, but anyone who helps you is in danger. And so we felt it was very important and that we couldn't really put into position the people who were helping us. Or in my case, because I would be making a lot of the trip decisions, I didn't feel I could put in the driver, the news assistant who's a Syrian who we work with, the photographer, the 2 photographers I work with are my dear friends, and a medic we were traveling with. I just didn't feel I was at the point anymore where I could gamble with their lives, because I thought that the odds of getting rolled up were so high that you'd almost be surprised if you came back out. And at that point we stopped, which was, I think, about the 1st of June was our last trip.
Could you trust, because to me it seems when you're reading it that they're getting like postcards and which group is a safe group, which is an Islamist group, which is a Al-Qaeda group, and how?
First of all, the groups aren't, I think, necessarily that distinct. There's a lot of movement back and forth between them. You'll meet, the Associated Press's old driver is now in Jabhat al-Nusra.
Which is one of the Al-Qaeda groups. Yeah, and I still talk to him regularly on Skype, and
Yeah, people come and go. So you'll have someone who's in one group, and then another group will get new arms or better leadership, and they'll migrate over to that group, and you'll have families that have sons in 3 groups. And so there's a huge lot of social mixing between them. So you're never really with one group. You might think you are, but I would be sitting with one group that's considered fairly secular, and guys would come in at dinner, we'd be sitting on the floor, and they'd grab my passport, which would be, sort of sitting in the backpack. They just rummage through your stuff and start looking at the stamps, and he's in Jabhat al-Nusra. But he's just a friend with this guy, and we're having dinner, so he came over. So you're never really that isolated, even if you think you are. But we found that there were people we could trust, but we didn't feel we could be risking their lives anymore. And we did what we would call a unilateral trip, where you go in alone without fighters. You just go in with activists and drivers. That, in my view, got too risky by early this year. So then we shifted to only going with fighters, and you wanted to go with fighters that you thought had, enough muscle, both physically and socially, that no one would mess with them. So that if you bumped into someone on the road at a pop-up checkpoint, that it would be too high a penalty for another group to give them a hard time, and that they wouldn't take you. There have been journalists taken now who were with 6 or 7 fighters. there are groups out there now that will grab Westerners as a policy, and they'll grab all the armed Syrians you're with. So you could be moving in 2 or 3 cars with 8 gunmen as part of covering this guerrilla group that you think is newsworthy, and they could bump into 20 guys with bigger guns, with dushkas on top of the pickup trucks, and you all get rolled up. I mean, at that point, it's kind of time to stop.
Dushkas.
Dushkas are 50 caliber machine gun.
One thing that you were on the Colbert Report about 6 months ago, and he asked a question which I thought was an interesting one because of your background, is when you're with a group at that time, because you have military training, did you ever have that sense like, I don't want to be with this crowd and what they're doing now? I think I'd rather be somewhere else.
Sure, I mean, that happens, I won't say all the time, but often. And I, you know, let's be
I
honest.
don't have any military experience, and I definitely had that feeling.
Yeah,
Like,
and
I don't think that sounds like a very good idea.
yeah, you see things that people in simple terms shouldn't be doing, that don't make sense, that are unnecessary, that are exceptionally dangerous. But I want to say that, you know, and I'll just say it, I've been with American military units that made me uncomfortable, you know, and where you're walking around on a patrol with some young sergeant and you're thinking, this guy's really underqualified. He's not making the right choices, and you can't say anything. You know, you can't run the patrol, you can't influence anything that happens, because at the point at which you step in and influence something, if anything bad happens after that, you own it. So you sometimes end up on walks, no matter who your hosts are, that are bad walks. And you can see it, and sometimes you can see it happening in slow motion in front of you over the course of a few hours. You get in deeper and deeper, and you can't break away. You know, it's not like I'm going to say goodbye to these guys and get on the bus. I mean, there's the only way in is the people you came out with, so you have to see it through.
So what's the New York Times coverage of Syria like now? How, I mean, if you can't have people on the ground, how do you report?
Well, it's really a sort of a group effort from various different directions. I mean, we now have certain reporters who can get visas to go to Damascus and go in on the government side. So that's one angle. Is, you know, people can go in and then they can actually meet government officials who are on the other side of the war from what Chris and I have mostly covered. So you'll have people that are able to go in, and then from there they can move around to a limited extent in sort of government-controlled areas. So that's kind of one line of reporting, and from there we get sort of the government perspective on things. We get some civilian reporting about communities that are still living under government-controlled areas, about how they feel about how the government is fighting the war, things like that. So that's kind of one area. From the opposition side, either we report from people that are connected to the opposition who are outside, either people in the border areas in Turkey and Lebanon, Jordan, we can talk to those people, or it's all sort of by remote control, as we call it, which is just basically over Skype with contacts that we have, people that we know from before, people that we find through various networks and whatever. And then there's all the social media stuff, which is kind of can inform you in a general way, but you have to be very sort of careful about how much of it you use, because it's very hard to verify it. It can a lot of times be very manipulative. But we're very handicapped in terms of covering large parts of the country, just because we can't get there. And the only information that's coming out is coming out from people who have a very, I wouldn't say they always just want to come out and lie, but they definitely have, everybody has an agenda everybody who has a way to get information out has an agenda. So you have to be very careful about how you navigate it all. And there are just huge swaths of the country that we just really don't know. We really don't know what's going on.
I'd like to suggest, though, this isn't really unique. I mean, immersion reporting, like we were describing a few minutes ago, is, I would say, inarguably the best type of reporting you can do in conflict. But it's not the only type of reporting. And it's almost all beats have many types of reporting besides the immersion model. I mean, when you cover the Chicago Police Department, you don't necessarily go live with the gangsters.
Ride along every day, right?
Yeah, and you don't ride along every day. You get a lot over the phone. You get a lot through contacts that you've known. You get a lot from interviews that maybe, I mean, you know, in Turkey you might be over the border, but you're not far. You're no farther from the story than, say, a reporter who was bound in Baghdad was from covering Anbar province or covering something down in Basra. So having done the immersion model and we've hired an incredibly talented and smart young Syrian reporter who works for us full time all day. I mean, he's nocturnal, and we keep him up in the day, so he's just round the clock working. We have a tremendous journalist in Beirut, Hueda Saad, and Hueda and Karam are continuously in contact with, I would say, dozens of people a day. They know hundreds of rebels, and so wherever things are happening, they're inhaling information through their reach out, which wouldn't be much different than a lot of things. You might cover a murder.
Going to the scene.
Yeah, in the day story without going to the scene. So it's imperfect for sure, but it's still possible.
Bill Keller quoted you saying a while ago that social media isn't journalism, that it's information. It's journalism is what you do with the social media. I wondered if you could.
Yeah,
is that
you try to reduce something to 3 quick sentences, and it's not quite complete. But
40 characters.
yeah, it's like a tweet, right? So social media is a form of communication that presents typically bits of information really fast. That information can be incredibly useful. It can also be incredibly flawed. There was a study done recently that I saw something about Twitter that said the Boston Marathon bombings, 20% of the tweets actually were accurate and true. And that not only were the other 80% false, but there was a population within that 80% of deliberately false information that was circulated by accounts that were trying to skew the conversation. And these accounts clustered, and these accounts were quite influential. And you could say, is that a knock on Twitter? I mean, maybe 20% of all human communication is accurate. So it might not be much different than the way people talk generally. But we would work with the social media as one of many strands of information, and we incorporate it all into what we hope is a more contextualized report. And you do see some social media, the Tumblr blogs, some of the Facebook pages, certainly some of the Instagram pages that have real photography that are doing journalism. But in the main, these are ways to sort of put a flash of information out that then needs a hell of a lot of work to get turned into journalism.
I wanted to go back to one thing that you had said earlier about, and David Rode, a colleague of yours, was here a year or so ago and talked about his captivity in Afghanistan and the question of young journalists. It was also in a book review in the Times Review this Sunday about Marie Colvin and a great war correspondent who died in Syria. But the question of a cautionary tale is the way the reviewer said it, is that her writings and her photographer's book about her is that young people eager to start out a career see conflict as a jump start. And what do you tell them?
You want to go first?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's a bad idea. I mean,
I mostly tell them don't go. Don't go cover something like this unless you think you bring something to it. It's not worth trying to make a shortcut in your career to do something like this. And it's an exceptionally difficult job. It warps most of the people who do it. Most of the people I know, I'm just about 50, most of the people I know have done this for a long time, have suffered a lot of problems. Some of my friends are dead, some are maimed. A lot have drug or alcohol problems or broken marriages or strain. It's not a line of work that you would really choose. Am I saying should no one do it? Of course not. I'm saying that the idea that a large population of people as a way to get quickly established in the business should rush out there because this is a shorter line than most. It's easier than covering. It's easier to do prominent work quickly than if you were to go cover, say, the city council or the police department or the American healthcare system or any number of thematic or civic beats that most of us start out in. But if you don't really have your journalistic skills mastered, if you don't really have a solid set of contacts with editors, if you don't really understand the material, don't go. you know? I often see people out on or near I won't say often, now and then I see people out on the battlefield or near the battlefield or intending to go to the battlefield who know nothing about the battlefield, nothing. And you can say to them, honestly, if you go out there and things start to happen around you, will you understand it? If you don't understand it, how are you going to articulate it effectively to your readers? What value added do you give to the experience that's worth risking your life and your family's security and your employer's attention at a minimum? I mean, we've seen a lot of people who we know disappear, get wounded, get killed out there. It puts the institutions they work for through an agony, you know, an agony. And their families suffer even worse. And so I'm pretty hard-headed about why you should go. I mean, my own experience is I didn't go until I'd already, you know, been in the Marine Corps for 6 or 7 years and spent years sort of researching the subject and the tactics. And so when things started to happen around me as a journalist, I kind of felt like I can slow the ball down here and recreate it journalistically. If I couldn't do that, I wouldn't be there. I wouldn't be there at all. I mean, if I thought that, you know, let me give you an example. Let's say you wanted to cover the NFL by running around on the field, you know, and there was a good chance you were going to get hit. Would you want to know football really well before you did that? You know, it's kind of similar. And I know that's not, I mean, it sounds like a bucket of cold water, but I mean it.
Well, and you started out as a police reporter in Providence, right? I mean, that was,
Yeah.
so I mean, in terms of paying dues, you certainly did that, and you've been in Chechnya and Afghanistan and Iraq and Libya and Syria now, and perhaps a lot more.
But it's, the idea that you've been a lot of places sort of makes you ready to do this job doesn't necessarily hold up. It's not where you've been, it's what you bring to the, you know, what's your beat approach. Ben's an Arabist. I mean, he has a special set of skills that are essential to have out there. And he usually doesn't try to cover the battlefield per se. He tries to cover the social experience of the people who are subjected to the war, who are living through the war. And he can do that better than I can. And so he has an approach. I have a different approach, covering the arms trade, the organization of the rebel groups, who they are, why they fight, who funds them, where they come from, where they get their stuff, what they want. You merge my little chips in the mosaic with Ben's little chips in the mosaic, with the people who are covering the regional politics, with the people who understand the waltzes and the capitals between the sort of chess masters who are trying to guide the war. Everyone kind of puts up their little chips on this mosaic and it becomes something coherent. But each of us, in our own body of work, is wholly insufficient. I mean, it's really each of us, when you add up everything we've done, is exceptionally limited and not all that valuable. It's in the aggregate that it kind of takes its shape. And if your piece you're not particularly good at, why are you there? And why are you risking your life? You know, there's a lot of other ways to commit some damn fine journalism, you know, without doing that.
Do you want to add anything?
Yeah, and I just think, like, I mean, for students and whatever, I just think when you sort of think about what you're going to do at the beginning of your career, I think it's very valuable to take the long view of things. You know, I mean, I think I mean, it took me sort of a long time even to realize that I wanted to be a journalist, and then even from there, it's sort of a long time to sort of get up and running. I mean, I sort of spent, you know, years and years thinking, like, what do you mean I should already be famous? I should be great already, you know? And like, well, I wasn't. I didn't really know what I was doing, you know? And so, I mean, I think, like, and I think this goes into the conflict thing, is, you know, these kinds of situations, you only get one shot to get it wrong, you know? And you really need to take the long view of, like, what do you want to do with your career? What do you want to, you know? And you could go into a situation like that, and that could be, you know, that could be it. But I just think you have to really take the long view of, like, you know, this isn't where you should start. You should start at places where you're going to learn all of these basic, you know, these basic techniques and basic rules of how journalism works. And then once you sort of get into that, you know, then you're really going to be able to make, you know, much better use of being in any kind of journalistic situation. And there's also something very valuable to, I mean, I think and also thinking about, when you're thinking about your career, it's also, what's another body of knowledge that you can bring to the table? I mean, in Chris's case, it's military experience, you know, and it's really understanding how conflict works and munitions and arms and how these things flow and how they affect the battlefield. I didn't know any of that stuff, but I could speak Arabic. So, like, I could go in and I could sit in a room with a bunch of guys drinking tea, and I could listen to people talking to each other, and I could listen to them all complaining about this one rebel commander. And then I could say, we need to find out who this guy is, because they're all ticked off at him because he has too many weapons and he's not helping anybody out. So we ask them, who is this guy? And then they tell us it's Abu Isa. who ends up becoming a huge guy. So we said, okay, well, let's go talk to him. And so we go talk to him, and so, but I mean, I think that most journalists that you're going to find who are going to go really far have sort of a second body of knowledge that they bring to it, whether it's knowledge about science, whether it's knowledge about some part of the world, whether it's China, whether it's the Middle East or whatever. And so I think that getting your journalistic skills is one thing, but then also finding another sort of set of knowledge that you can bring that's going to allow you or make it easier for you to sort of interpret what you're seeing for your readers. It's an incredibly valuable thing to have. So.
I wanted to go to the audience for your questions. There are folks who have microphones, and since we're recording it, please wait till they get to you with the microphone before speaking. And over here, he's on our way.
In the poison gas investigation, can we trust the Syrian government?
Well, I don't think the Syrian government has proven itself to be a very credible organization over the last 2.5 years. I think that was a particularly tricky thing to investigate just because the stakes were so high. I mean, just the fact that one of the few very specific things that Obama did say about Syria was that use of chemical weapons was a red line. So then as soon as there were somewhat credible reports that this had actually happened, the stakes were so high on both sides. I mean, for the government to say, no, of course we didn't, and then for the opposition to say, oh, of course you did. So, Obama, come bomb Syria for us. The stakes got to be so high. So, I mean, I don't think that the information that's come out since has the information that's come out since has pretty much disproven everything that the Syrian government said about that incident. Does that answer your question?
I'll answer it. No. But what government can you trust? So I don't put them in a different box. I mean, though their culpability may be fairly clear here, and demonstrably so. I've been lied to a lot by my own government at every level. So I don't think that the Syrian government is. I mean, it may be different as a matter of degree. It may not speak to us in English usually, but I don't trust it, nor do I trust any government, frankly.
Greetings, congratulations.
Thank you.
I met the person who was representing Al Jazeera in Washington, D.C. a number of years ago. And he was talking about this lack of standards for journalism in the Middle East and also in Asia. And he said there were no journalism schools the way we know them, no places where they studied ethics of journalism or journalism law or anything else, and that most of the time it was the publishers' relatives that would become journalists. So my question to both of you is, what is it like to work with fellow and sister journalists in that part of the world who haven't received the training that American journalists receive, and also who very often are not there for the same reasons? What do you find discrepancy in the way information is conveyed, and can you even trust your fellow journalists there?
I must say there is a journalism school in Qatar, and that is trying to rectify that. But please, answer. Yeah.
I mean, I guess it depends if you mean sort of direct colleagues and people that we're actually working with in production of our own stuff, or if you mean just sort of colleagues that we interact with while we do our job. I mean, I guess I'll talk a bit about both. I mean, I think it is true that, and I don't just want to pick on the Middle East. I think that if you even look at sort of British newspaper culture, it's quite different than American newspaper culture. Whereas I think American newspapers, even though most of them do have, to their general readers, can sort of pick out what their general ideological direction is, even though we all say, of course, we don't have an ideological direction. I think in Europe, it's much more common to say, this is the leftist paper, and this is the conservative paper, and this is the... I mean, I think in the Middle East, you do have much more of a culture of newspapers as sort of a vanity project by somebody with a lot of money. Al Jazeera is a perfect example, which you mentioned. I mean, this is a channel that was, created by the emir of an incredibly rich country in order to basically operate as an arm of this country's foreign policy. So the more that you know, I mean, I guess, so that when I'm working in a place like I live in Lebanon, when I'm working in Lebanon has a very active local media. But you sort of have to do everything that you can to get to know where everything comes from. There's a lot of quite good newspapers, but they're all linked to somebody, and they're all from somewhere. And so which doesn't mean that they don't have good information, but some of them are going to have better information about some things, and some of them are going to have an agenda. And I mean, it's sort of what you deal with in just reporting anything, is that anytime you use anything as a source, any person that you meet or any other, you know, you're always going through this process of like, where is this person coming from? How credible is this person? Or, I mean, I think in terms of journalists that we sort of bring on board to work with us, I mean, there's always a lot of training involved, you know, where you bring people on, and usually I think we usually tend to work with people that don't have any journalism background, which is probably easier, because then you can kind of start from the beginning, and you can sort of explain to them, well, this is how we work, and this is why we work this way, and this is the reason for this and stuff. And I do think that and I don't mean this just to sort of, you know, toot the horn of the New York Times and sort of Western media, but I do think that people do recognize the value of sort of an American media model where we're not linked to a political party, or we're not linked to a specific rich individual who's picking up the phone when something appears on the front page or whatever. I mean, I do think that people do kind of respect that, but.
I think out of necessity too, in Iraq certainly there was times when the journalists in Baghdad simply couldn't get out and around the country, and so a long 10-year process of training people who were Iraqis to understand the kind of journalistic practices and ethics about it.
And I don't think it's just in the Middle East. I mean, I lived and worked in Russia for a run of years, and it was the same thing. I mean, the newspapers had different ideological positions, different ownership, different agendas, and it was pretty clear. And, you know, I would have Russian journalists come up to me sometimes and say, man, I wish I could work like you. You know, I wish I could say what I know, or chase what I want to chase, and I can't. And this is pretty common across the world still. In a lot of fairly rigid societies, or in areas where there's huge momentous questions being sorted out by competitors. And so, you know, you've got the sort of Gulfi media and the Shia media taking exact opposite positions. I mean, you know, you could put something that's red on the table and one would say it's brown and the other would say it's yellow. And I mean, they just have a bent that is probably not in the life of our careers anything but indelible. And so we try to find people we can work with, and where there is a lot of sort of staff shuffling that goes on at the various newspapers. I mean, Ben had a great guy working for him with for the AP, and we poached him. then we poached Ben. So.
Well, he called and asked me. He said, hey, I got a job offer from the New York Times. I was like, well, take it. What do you?
Put in a good word for me.
Yeah.
Speaking of social media,
Right.
how did you protect your sources, and how did you gain the trust of rebel groups?
Well,
I mean, first of all, some of our sources aren't named. You start with a very basic position right there. We don't disclose who they are or where they are. So that's one of the first steps. There have been stories we've worked on, including one fairly recently that involved sources who were in, you know, a crisis of conscience and were reporting about rebel actions that were criminal, and they were endangering themselves by reporting this. And so we would wait, in some cases, a bit of time until that source could get out of proximity of danger before we would report that. And then we would talk with the source. I mean, one of the main ways you protect a source is you make damn sure the source knows what they're getting themselves into. Right. You sit with them and you say, you know who I am. This is what I propose doing with what you're talking about. These may be the sort of likely ramifications for you of that. Are you aware of this? Are you okay with this? What can you do to mitigate this? How can we help you mitigate this? I mean, we spend a lot of time protecting different sources in different ways, depending on what we think their risk exposures are. But that's a big part of the job, because you get it wrong, it's not just on the moral equation, you know, you've got another stain on your soul. In practical sense, you know, it could wreck you, it could ruin you. If you're someone who burns their sources, guess what you don't have any more of? Sources, much less reputation.
What's that question? This lady here? I'll wait for the microphone, please.
What is something or anything that left you strong impressions or feelings when you were in Syria, if any?
I don't know, pretty much everything. I mean, it's
Syria is terrible. And when you go in there, you trip over really horrifying, sorrowful things all the time. You know, you'll go in to do one thing and you'll find that, you know, an entire village that's getting shelled has been abandoned, except for a few families who decided to stick around, and they're living in caves. And you think you can sort of understand what that means, right? I mean, these are old Roman caves. Some of them are pretty well built. So you think you understand it, and you walk in there and you see, you know, hanging in a hammock, a baby that's 3 weeks old. It's never really been out, baby's never really been outside, or just barely. You have impressions all the time, and this is common to war, not just in Syria, where you're with these people who are incredibly decent people. They're just like everybody here. They're warm, they're hospitable, they're caring, they have families, extended families, they have friends, they have jobs. And the only one place where they're awful is on the subject of the people they're fighting. And then they can be completely irrational and vicious. And it's incredibly disorienting to see a society that's lost its compact, where we agree not to kill each other over whatever our disputes are, and a place where killing each other becomes the norm or the ambition. And people you're hanging around with, you're having meals with, who are wonderful, a moment later a prisoner will be walked by and they'll jump up from the table and punch him hard in the face. And not long after that, they'll take that prisoner and deceive the prisoner into thinking that they're being released, and put them behind the wheel of a truck bomb and send them to the checkpoint. And you're hanging out with these people. And up until that moment, you've had ordinary exchanges like you would have in life with any number of people. And I mean, war is a terribly corrupting force, not just Islamic war. I mean, we like to sort of reduce to caricature the people the United States has been at odds with, but all war. And Syria pushes it in front of you every trip in really, really stark detail.
While we wait for another question, I was going to ask you about what is U.S. policy on Syria? How do you understand it?
I asked you this earlier. Yeah. What's the U.S. policy on Syria? Because I've been trying to figure it out for a couple of years.
I mean, it's funny because I think that there's sort of living in the Middle East, and, you know, I think that it's most people that you talk to in the Middle East are convinced that the U.S. is running everything, that like it's all just sort of run by remote control from Washington, and they just, you know, and so I just find it's just sort of amazing to me how often I have to tell people, like, no, actually, I don't think they really have any clue what they're doing. I think they're trying to figure it out as they go, and there's like a lot of improvisation, a lot of trying to catch up with events and stuff, which I think has been, you know, I don't think there's ever been much indication that there's any kind of a strategy on what the U.S. wants to do in Syria, of what our role should be, what we would like to see this thing turn out as, or yeah, there's not much. There's never really been a clear explanation of, other than that. Wouldn't it be great if we got rid of Assad? Okay, well, we're not going to talk about how that should happen. We're not going to enable the people that we think would be the ones to be able to do that, but
in practical terms, wars are really hard to guide, even when you're fighting them. But when you're not fighting them, when you're trying to guide them sort of remotely, they're almost impossible to have a significant influence over. But the United States, I mean, you say, what's the policy? I'm not sure there is one. I mean, I'm sure you could bring up someone from the State Department here and they'd explain it to you, and we'd all fall asleep. Because you can't really see out there a set of actions that's linked up to a set of ambitions. The policy in Syria, to me, seems to be a bunch of things they don't want to have happen. You know, we don't want Islamists to take over. We don't want Assad to continue. We don't want chemical weapons to be used. We don't want Iran's influence to grow. We don't want chaos, disorder, human suffering on a vast scale. You have a lot of those things are what you have, and not really connected to any levers to prevent it. So the policy, and the other thing that usually when you have a policy in Washington on anything, you've got a gray cardinal. You've got someone leading it, right? There's someone who's taken charge of it. When name the person, the Syria person inside the Beltway. I'm not sure you can. That person's never emerged. It seems to be, there's a lot of people I have interacted with a little bit, sort of at the mid-level, who really do care and really do and think about Syria and would like somehow to influence, but they're really above them are a bunch of people who don't want to be associated with Syria, including, I think, their president.
I think a lot of this is, this is where we've arrived. This is what we've arrived at after the last 10, 12 years. This is after Afghanistan, this is after Iraq, this is after Libya, where I think all through the Bush years there was this, at least in some sectors, there was this great faith in American military might. We can go into these countries and we can sort it out and we're going to create beautiful, blooming democracies. And, well, we pretty much failed on all three. I think that the big lesson was, okay, well, we do have the military might. We can win the wars. We can give a win to one side, but we really have little control over what happens after that. So I think that probably what we're seeing now is the reaction to that. Well, which is probably the pendulum swinging, completely in the other direction, as in well, let's just try to stay as far away from this thing as we can. So
it happened at the wrong moment in history for Syrians to expect any outside help from the United States.
After Iraq,
even the Pentagon
exhausted
doesn't want a piece
yeah.
of this. After 10 or 12 years of war, you talk to most of the career officers now who had a piece of some of that activity and as younger officers in Afghanistan, Iraq, and they're not especially interested in going to Syria. There's no real advocacy from any organization in Washington, to do something comprehensive with American might about Syria.
Yeah, and then you have a president who came into power criticizing the Iraq War, and then you have his one experience with military intervention was Libya, where it's still run by a bunch of militias, and we sort of came in and destroyed the government's army for them, and they marched into Tripoli, and then they killed our ambassador. So all of this reaction is kind of for a reason, but I think it has resulted in sort of a muddle when it comes to long-term strategy or policy. Yeah.
I have a question, Donna. We have this,
Okay.
okay.
So who's got a mic?
After these two others here. Please. Who's got the mic?
Oh, right here.
I guess I'm curious to know what each of you would like to do next in your career if you could pick and choose. Where would you like to go? I'm assuming Syria is not in the immediate future.
Well, I've been working for about almost 2 years now, off and on a pretty large project. In the last 2 or 3 months, I've been working on it full time, and I'm enjoying it. And it's going to take me a little while longer to finish it. And when I'm done with that, I think I'll go back to doing what I did, which is getting back out into the field in one of these conflicts in some capacity. So I'm not really looking for a change. I have reoriented and had the chance to close out something that's been in my to-do list forever. And it's a different rhythm, and I like the rhythm, but I don't really want to repeat that rhythm endlessly. So I'll go back out to the field. I think that in my case, all of my best work happens from being there, from being there and from seeing it, from absorbing it yourself. I can't do it forever. I'm pushing 50. I've got bum hinges and ringing ears and bad vision and just a lot less stamina than I had even 6, 8 years or 10 years ago. So I won't do it forever, but I think in the medium term, I'm going to be doing pretty much the same thing. And when I get done with that, I'll look up and figure out what's next.
There was another.
You go, Ben. No. We're not going to
Oh,
let
sorry.
Ben off the
Oh,
hook.
sorry.
Well, I
That's right,
just started a new job, so I'm still I just moved to the Times about 6 months ago, and so I'm still just, I think now I have a good idea how stuff works, but based in Beirut, I'm still will cover Syria as much as I can from different angles and stuff, and I'm sort of hoping to look a bit more regionally and sort of use my knowledge of the Middle East and sort of branch out, and I've been able to do a good amount of that. I was just in the Gulf, and I've spent a good amount of time in Egypt as well, and know the situation there.
Last week,
right.
Riyadh the week before,
Right,
and Cairo before that.
Right.
And
So
Beirut,
I'll continue to do that and kind of expand on following everything that's going on over there. So.
There's the mic, please, lady.
You seem to have two different approaches to this, but how important would you say it is for journalists to be fluent in a second language? And I guess what is the limit of the work you can do using interpreters and translators?
In my case, it's been essential. I don't think I would have got any of my jobs if I didn't have Arabic. I think it was sort of like, it was that extra body of knowledge that allowed me to sort of, get my first job with AP, and then I'm sure it played a role in, in the Times being interested in me as well. So, I mean, for me, like, it's very essential for what I do, but there's plenty of other reporters who work in places where they don't speak the main language there, and they're able to do fine work and stuff. So I think it's certainly not going to hurt. I mean, I think there's never a place where it's not going to be some kind of advantage. So I think it's always a valuable thing to have. But there are plenty of people who are able to work without it, and I don't think I've ever worked in a place where I've never sort of gotten out of that and worked in a place where I wasn't able to really speak with people. So I don't know. You've worked all over the place.
Yeah, and Ben will work all over the place the more time he spends at the Times, so you'll be in situations where you don't know the language. Right. I'd echo what Ben said. The more language you have, the better. You can work really well through good translators. And I like it. I'm hard of hearing, so I actually sometimes really enjoy working in environments where I don't have the language, because the translator slows everything down. Everything starts to go at half speed, and it's really good for quality control on a lot of levels. So it's good, but it'd be better if I spoke the language. Let's not pretend anything. But so the more languages you have, the better. And when I was working in Russia and I had Russian, I often, as Ben describes, overheard things. Just reading graffiti can be a value. And when I'm moving through other parts of the world where I don't have that, it gets it's more limited. A little bit less is getting in. That can be a value in helping you focus on what you're really focusing on, because you're not overhearing stuff. You're not able to translate every passing word. But it can raise the dangers too. Sometimes when people are shouting out a bunch of things in Arabic and you don't understand it. I mean, I was in a really horrible battle earlier this year with a translator. It was the first time he'd been in it, and he was a little bit frozen up, and he was doing fine, and I told him at one point, I said, imagine if all this was happening around you in German. You got to bring a little bit of it, you got to translate a little bit of it just for safety. And he got it, but that's not his fault, that's mine for not having the language. But you can't have every language on earth for where there will be war. It's not possible, but the more you get, the better you'll be. And I've got my kids all taking languages, yeah, of course.
Donna?
So, and I'm told this is the last question. Okay, so I wanted to know, I mean, first I did have a comment. I was really struck by both Ben and Chris, how incredibly humble you are given the work that you do and the work that you've done. And, sort of on behalf of the school, I just find you inspirational, because, I mean, our students really need to see what it's like to be out there, and something we can't really give them, but you do. So on behalf of them, I really do thank you. But I had a question. I think you two probably know about as much about Syria as anybody that I've read or met, and I just wondered, if you were kings of the world, what would you do about Syria? Or if you had Obama's ear, say, I mean, seriously, can we do anything? I mean, can anybody do anything?
So, in 2006, when Iraq was completely off the hinges, and I was at the age you would be where you're commanding a battalion. So a lot of my peers were commanding battalions, or guys, when I was in the Marine Corps, or guys who I knew who had been enlisted, were senior enlisted, and they were basically running the day-to-day of the war. Not the Petraeus level nonsense that was being circulated, but actually out there in the positions, living it. And I sort of surveyed them and said, look, this is just you and me talking, so I can kind of get my head around the scope of our problems and maybe some ways through it. But I'd like to put a piece of paper in front of you and, pop quiz. Tell me how we fix this. What's the way out? And everybody's like, I don't know. No one wanted to put the pen to paper. I mean, some problems are so complicated that when you're thick in close to them, you can't see really what to do about them. You can't imagine how you influence something so big. Syria's pretty close to that. And I'm not saying this from a defeatist attitude, and I'm not saying this like from the American policy attitude, like what would I tell the Syrians to do? Much less what we would do as Westerners if we wanted to commit in some more substantial way. And I'm not sure how you guide this thing. I mean, find the off button, right? But what does that get you? Then, the people who know Syria best are not me. Maybe Ben's, And I'm not in that rank. Ben's closer to that core. But those who do know it see this largely as the repeat chapter of a 1,000-year-old war, or much more than 1,000 years old, and that this is a sort of a rebalancing, or an effort at rebalancing by competing factions on both sides of the Islamic faith. And more recently, I mean, when you talk to Syrians, many of them will say, you know, we lost Baghdad. It was a Sunni capital, and you guys gave it to the Shia, and so we're taking Damascus. I mean, there are all sorts of agendas that are playing through here that have roots in recent history, that have roots in ancient history, and then have roots in this immediate bloodshed. You know, when people start killing each other, they stay pissed off for a long time, and they want to do a lot about it. And all of these things, the immediate, the recent past, the distant past, are all factored through it. And I don't know how you draw the map, if you could draw the map, and make it work. So that's my sort of strikeout.
Yeah, I mean, I have no magic button or magic solution or whatever. I mean, I think that I have some sort of sympathy for sort of I guess sort of the Obama lack of strategy on Syria, because I mean, all my young adulthood was all through, Iraq and Afghanistan, and sort of watching these wars where you're just kind of like, okay, well, we went in and we changed the government and it's still a mess, and so I don't know if, I don't know how you save Syria. I don't know what you do, but I do think that, I think Chris is right in that we do have to recognize that this is not, there are no easy solutions. Like at the end, this is something that this as a culture and as a place and as a group of people who are sharing this plot of land, this is something that they have to work out. And it's sort of to take a very cruel sort of long-term historical perspective, like civil wars happen for a reason. They happen because the people who are living in this society need to sort out their arrangement. And for an outside power to come in and sort of give it to one side or the other, that doesn't really solve the root issue. I think as we saw in Iraq, we sort of came in and the American military sort of helped one side take it. Well, and that didn't really solve anything. The country's still a total mess. So I'm very skeptical of anybody who comes up with saying, oh, the Americans, they can do this, or we could arm the rebels and then the rebels will take Damascus and everything will be great. Oh, will it? Well, probably not, or we should do this or this, or, one thing that I think we could definitely do would be to, ramp up more on the humanitarian side. Sort of a huge portion of this crisis is just the humanitarian side. Humanitarian crisis, the huge numbers of refugees that are sort of flooding across all of Syria's borders. That's one thing, that there could definitely be a lot more effort in sort of both the fallout in the host nations, especially I think Jordan and Lebanon are the ones that are getting hit the hardest, Iraq as well, and then Turkey to a somewhat lesser extent. But everybody can sort of kick in and help and try to manage those, and that can also keep the violence from exploding more into some of these countries. But in terms of the war itself, I don't know how you stop it. Yeah.
From your observations about humanitarian, which organizations have you been impressed by?
I haven't done a lot. I just haven't done a lot of on-the-ground reporting on the humanitarian stuff. But there's plenty of organizations that are sort of working on the ground. I know a lot of them in Lebanon. I know Mercy Corps is doing stuff. Crisis Committee, International. What are they? The International Rescue Committee. The Norwegians have a very good refugee organization, the Danish, and so there's like a lot of the smaller organizations that are doing sort of different projects and stuff, but it's all sort of under the umbrella of the UN. I don't know if I've come across any specific organizations that I thought were, super.
I'm going to go back to your question first, which is that the trouble with answering your question is that it feels morally impossible to do nothing. It's an agony in there. And when you see it, and you see the countries around it, and the refugees, and the destruction inside, and the brutality by both sides, and the suffering of the people who are caught between these competing factions and these competing, external powers and their ideas for Syria's direction, you want to do something. It feels impossible to do nothing. And you can do a lot, like you're talking about with aid, and there are good aid groups. Some of them are small, some of them are big. The UN does some, the Turkish government has done a lot, the Jordanians are doing a lot. There's no one sort of silver bullet organization. And you can do things like bring in medicine. You know, you can do things like providing the housing and the medical care and the shelter and the long-term aid it's going to take for this massively displaced population. Getting into lethal aid is a little bit of a trickier question. What's the best way? Should you at all? If you don't, somebody else does, or you're taken out of influence. But when you do, it usually goes wrong. I mean, it's a real hellish puzzle. And I can kind of understand why people would want to step in all sorts of different ways, from medicines to bullets. You can see it. I mean, when you look at what you're seeing, and on both sides, I'm not taking one side or the other. I mean, if you read like Bobby Worth's incredible work on, you know, what some of the families on the regime side have been going through and what they fear, I mean, it's every bit as compelling as what the Sunni side has been suffering at the human level, at the family level, and all these communities that, you know, for the last several decades lived reasonably well together and sometimes lived intimately quite well, depending on the place and the time. That's been shattered, and it's been replaced with suspicion and hatred and menace. And I don't know how it stops, but you also can't imagine doing nothing, which is one of the reasons we kept going back. Not because we had an answer, but that the idea that maybe you can sketch it for someone who does, or someone who will.
Sounds like the Balkans at one point. I mean, the, you know, internecine warfare. There was another question here. Some, who? There's another class coming in, so they'll have to set up. So one more question. Okay. Take it outside. Who's got the mic here? All right.
Yeah. You are both very inspirational, but you both gave a lot of reasons why young journalists should not do what you're doing. I'm just wondering, why is it that you do what you're doing? What is it that gives you the passion and the drive? Because even people with your skill sets don't do what you're doing. So I just want to get a sense of your commitment to this kind of work.
Well, I think there's a combination of things. I think part of it is, I mean, from a professional standpoint, it's, you know, feeling that you can really contribute something, feeling that, you know, you can go in and it's a place where there's not a lot of work being done, so you can go in and contribute something. I mean, I think, you know, there is, you know, everyone, I think that the common sort of corny answer is, you know, feeling this great responsibility, and I think there is always a sense of that. I think it's also that you enjoy it, you know. I mean, I think that that's usually, you know, sometimes people forget that, but we do this because we enjoy it, because it's very exciting to go into these places, and it's very satisfying work-wise to feel like you can, you know, to be able to go into a place like this and then feel like you can actually do something with this story, and that you can get it out, and that you can, you know, that you can sort of shed light on something that otherwise is going to remain fairly dark, and people are not going to know that much about. So I think it's a combination of motivations.
So you ready to be my shrink? You know, look, why do I do it? I don't agree with Ben. I don't enjoy it for the most part. I'm filled with a sense of dread a lot of time out there, because I have to make decisions and my friends are with me. And you know, the last couple times I went in, you're having these meals in Turkey right before you cross, and everyone's kind of cheerful and amped up, and I'm thinking, you know, what if I get one of these guys killed in the next few days? For what, a story? You know? But you go in. And, you know, why do you go in? I mean, what do they say? All actions are over-motivated? I mean, I have a lot of reasons. I have guilt if I don't go in. I mean, I've spent my career, 2 careers, developing this skill set. It's kind of hard to stay home and have that be idle. And this isn't different. A lot of soldiers will tell you this, like the guys who are the explosive ordnance disposal techs, the people who are disabling the bombs, the makeshift bombs in Iraq and Afghanistan. And it's a hard skill set to develop. It takes a lot of time, and it's hard to be good at. But it saves lives. I mean, you know you're saving lives. I mean, it's a measurable thing. I mean, there's a lot of things that can be, jobs in the military that can be objectionable, but, you know, disabling bombs that another human being might step on, I mean, developing that skill is something really special, and then not using it can be psychologically painful while bombs are still being placed out along the roads and in the markets. So for me, some of it is guilt. You know, I've got this skill set. I can tell a certain kind of story if I do a certain kind of reporting. I feel I got to go do it. Some of it is this bond of friendship. I have a couple of photographers I've worked with, 3 or 4 photographers I've worked with in my career, 2 who are still active, one who lost his legs. And I kind of feel like I need to be out there with them. I want to be out there with them. I want to plan stories with them and work with them in ways that I think we're mitigating the risks but hitting good journalistic targets. And it's hard not to, so I keep doing it. And then the other thing is just curiosity. I don't deceive myself into thinking I'm going to change much. I mean, a minute ago I said it'd be nice to think you could sort of sketch the world so someone could come along and fix it. Yeah, maybe, but most of what you do falls on people who are not especially committed to even necessarily reading it to the bottom, much less doing something about it, you know? But you are driven by this curiosity. There is a tremendous serendipity to going into a place and discovering something untold that you think is important and then getting it out there and circulating it. And that, I guess that's, when you say you enjoy it, yeah, I enjoy that part of it.
Right.
But the whole thing, I mean, you get this sense of dread walking over you or walking beside you, stalking you everywhere you go. And then you add in what the costs are to your family, which is a whole other hour we could talk about that. And it's pretty rough. But like I said to a question a few minutes ago, I think we'll stay at it for a little bit, for at least a few more years. You know, I at one point told myself I was going to close out the Afghan war and then maybe look up and change. And then this so-called Arab Spring happened, and we've been busy. And when that, you know, when we're done with Syria, and we kind of are at the moment for the field work, the type of work I do, I can't expect to do in Syria in the foreseeable future. But when I finish this project, I'm going to call up my boss and the photographer, Tyler Hicks, I work with the most, and say, hey, what are we cooking up next? And we'll go do something similar, because I don't really know how to stop.
Well, here's where we're going to stop. Thank you so much, really. I believe there's some drinks and snacks outside.